In the last chapter, we talked about the receptors of the somatosensory system and how those receptors receive and encode the information that is eventually going to make it up to the brain. So in this section, we're going to talk about how it makes it up to the brain. Because if it can't get to the brain, well, then we can't use it, right? So we have to detect it, and then we have to be able to use that information. So the learning objectives for this part of Chapter 11, remember Chapter 11 is going to be divided between this module and the next module. So I want you to be able to state what the primary, what the function of the primary somatosensory cortex is, and to be able to state where each of the three main types of sensory relay tracts start and end, and what type of information is transmitted in each tract. So the three main tracts that we're going to talk about are the conscious relay pathway, the divergent tract, and the non-conscious. So we'll talk about each one of those individually. What we talked about in Chapter 10 was basically the first step in the sensation experience, receiving and encoding that information into a form that neurons can use, and encoding it into neural energy. So the second step of the somatosensation experience is that the action potential in the peripheral axon of the sensory neuron is conducted to the soma in the dorsal root ganglion and then into the spinal cord. So remember, it's that pseudo-unipolar neuron, the soma of peripheral sensory neurons live in the dorsal root ganglion of the spinal cord, or of the peripheral nerve going into the spinal cord. So that second step is, the first step is the sensation information is encoded and sent up, that receptor potential sets off an action potential in the peripheral axon, and it's conducted to the soma in the dorsal root ganglion, and from there into the spinal cord. So the third step in the sensation experience is that information ascends to the brainstem, basically, via bundles of axons. And those bundles of axons are called tracts. They're white matter in the spinal cord, and they go to various regions of the brain. A bundle of axons in the central nervous system with the same origin and a common termination is referred to several different ways. The first way, it's called a tract, like the spinothalamic tract. And like a lot of the things I like in the body, a lot of the tracts tell you where they go to and from in their names. So you got to love that. It basically, the name of it gives you the answer. Another name for a tract is a column, a lemniscus, or a fascicle. So we talked about fascicles and muscles way back when, probably in kinesiology, as being bundles of muscle fibers, while a nerve fascicle is bundles of nerve fibers. So basically, it's a bundle of axons in the white matter with the same origin and a common termination. So it's a superhighway, basically, going from the periphery to the central nervous system, or from the central nervous system to the periphery. The afferent pathways, somatosensory pathways, of course, are going from the periphery to the central nervous system. Somatosensory pathways are named for the origin and termination of the tract, and the tract contains the second neuron in the series, so it's a 3-neuron series. The first neuron is that sensory receptor. The second neuron is the tract that goes up to the central nervous system, and the third neuron projects from different areas in the central nervous system to the cerebral cortex. So we'll talk about those. So people who don't have the proper somatosensory information coming in are prone to pressure-induced skin lesions, burns, and joint damage. So the somatosensory information that we're getting from the periphery is protecting us. protecting us from the world out there. Somatosensation is necessary for accurate control of movements because we have that conscious proprioception that's telling us where we are in space and allowing us to make corrections. It protects us against injury, and it helps us to gain valuable information that contributes to our perception of the world around us. So super important information coming in through the somatosensory tracts. All of these tracts are basically our pathways to the brain. There are important distinctions among the types of pathways and the fidelity of information that is conveyed. So when we talk about fidelity of information, we mean how true is that to what the sensation is that we're really feeling is. So high fidelity transmission of sound means it sounds like it really sounds in real life. High fidelity transmission of nerve impulses provides accurate details regarding the location of the stimulation. The ability to identify location of a stimulus is achieved by the anatomic arrangement of axons in the pathways. And we will talk about this. We'll talk about it a lot, actually. We'll talk about it again in the spinal cord chapter. We'll talk about how it's arranged in the brain. So very interesting. So we can tell we have a place in our brain that corresponds to every place on our body, and that's how we know where the stimulus is coming from, when it works correctly. When we describe pathways in the nervous system, only the neurons with long axons that connect distant regions of the nervous system, which are called projection neurons, are counted. All the little interneurons and all the little worker bees of the nervous system aren't really counted. We're just talking about the tracts, the long bundles. The tract is the bundle of axons with the same origin and common termination. Somatosensory pathways are often named for the origin and termination of the tract that contains the second neuron in the series. So the good thing about that is they're easy to remember. The spinothalamic tract goes from the spine to the thalamus. So the name of the tract actually gives you its origin and termination, which is super cool. Love things that tell you what they're doing. So there's 3 types of pathways that bring information to the brain. And we're going to talk about each one of them in detail, but we're going to briefly go over them right now. So the 3 types are conscious relay pathways, divergent pathways, and non-conscious relay pathways. Sometimes non-conscious relay pathways are also called unconscious relay pathways. So the important distinction between the pathways is the fidelity of information that is conveyed. The information in the conscious relay pathway is transmitted with high fidelity, meaning it provides accurate details about the stimulus and its location. We refer to these as discriminative sensations. So these pathways bring information about the location and type of stimulus to conscious awareness in the cerebral cortex. That's why it's called the conscious relay pathways. Both conscious and non-conscious information is relayed in the divergent pathways. So it's called divergent because they go lots of different places, the pathways. They end up at different places in the brain. So some of them are recording conscious information, some of them unconscious or non-conscious information. So the divergent pathways transmit information from many locations from the periphery to many locations in the brainstem and cerebrum, and they use varying numbers of neurons. And so remember we said the number of synapses, if you have more synapses, it slows the information down. So if you have more neurons, you have more synapses, and the information might not get there as quickly. Non-conscious pathways include proprioceptive and other movement-related information that goes straight to the cerebellum, and we are not aware of it. So all that proprioceptive information goes to the cerebellum. The cerebellum compares it with your intended movements, and it feeds back that information to the brain to correct your movements. So all of that's going on in the background, and we don't even know about it, which is pretty cool. So the conscious relay pathways bring information about the location and type of stimuli to the cerebral cortex. They're high fidelity. They're accurate details about stimuli and location. And it's somatotopically arranged, meaning the information in the brain is arranged similarly to the actual anatomic arrangement. So the brain says, oh, that's where I'm feeling that sensation. It can identify where it is in the body. Pretty cool. So the conscious relay pathways transmit all 4 types of somatosensation, which reach conscious awareness. That's important. Light touch, proprioception, nociception, and temperature. Pathways to consciousness travel upward in the spinal cord via 2 routes. So the first route are the dorsal columns, and the second is the anterolateral tracts. So this diagram from the picture shows on the left side, it shows the anterolateral column, and the spinothalamic tracts run in the anterolateral column, and it shows the dorsal column on the right side. There's really one on each side. There's right and left, but this just for simplifying the picture, it shows the dorsal column on the right and the anterolateral column on the left. They really are, there are 2 on each side. But to be aware of sensation, the information must travel to the thalamus for crude awareness. It has to go to the cerebral cortex for discriminative and fine resolution. So in order to be aware of it at all, it has to go to the thalamus. So I don't know if any of you are old enough or silly enough to have watched the movie Osmosis Jones. In that movie, it's the cartoon depiction of the body, sort of, and it's actually really good and very, very well done in terms of accuracy of information. But in that movie, the thalamus was like the executive assistant for the brain. The brain was the boss. So nothing got to the boss unless it went through the executive assistant first. So you can think of the thalamus as your executive assistant for your brain. However, lots of good processing goes on in the thalamus, so the executive assistant's probably underpaid because that thalamus is doing a ton of work for us. I don't know, maybe it's not underpaid. Maybe it gets a lot of the good stuff because it's right in the middle of the brain. Anyway, and to leave that analogy, just leave it by the side of the road, the divergent pathways, information is transmitted to many locations in the brainstem and cerebrum, and it uses pathways with varying number of neurons. I said this already, but I'm saying it again because it bears repeating. Sensory information is used at both the conscious and non-conscious levels. That's why it's divergent. It doesn't just go to one place. In this conscious relay pathways, they go bam, they're going to the thalamus. But the divergent pathways, they go all over the place. Aching pain is a form of sensation that's transmitted via divergent pathways in the central nervous system. So we'll talk about the difference between fast spinothalamic pain, which travels in those anterolateral columns, and aching pain, which is transmitted via the divergent pathways. They're different pathways, so fast pain versus slow pain. And the non-conscious relay pathways send non-conscious proprioceptive and other movement-related information to the cerebellum. The information plays an essential role in automatic adjustments of our movement and posture. The cerebellum compares intended motor output with the actual movement output by making corrections to neural commands via other connections with other brain areas. So the cerebellum is in the background working on things and we don't even know about it. Pretty nice of the cerebellum to do that for us. So we're still heading towards the cerebral cortex. So after the thalamus gives us crude awareness of sensations, then it goes to the cerebral cortex. Those neurons in the thalamus, the nuclei in the thalamus, project to the cerebral cortex, generally to the primary and sensory, primary and secondary sensory cortices. So the primary sensory cortex, it is simple sensory discrimination. It discriminates the intensity and quality of sensation. And then the secondary sensory cortex recognizes that sensation and says, oh, wait a minute, I know what this is. So let's just say, for example, we hear music. There's some sensory information. And our primary sensory cortex says it's a sound. It's loud, and it's over there to the left. The second sensory cortex says, wait a minute, I know what that is. That's music. I've heard that before. I better go to the association cortex and find out what song it is, or whether I like it and I need to turn the radio down. So you go to the association cortex and it says, well, I really like this song, crank it up, send some information to the motor planning areas to put that arm out and turn up that music. In motions and memory, it says, oh, I love this song. I used to listen to this song way back when, or whatever. Or it interprets the sensation. And it maybe if there's a motor act that needs to happen, it sends that information to the motor cortex and motor planning areas so we can plan that motor act. So something really simple, a sensation coming in, it runs through this whole series in the cerebral cortex. So we'll come back there. We'll come back to this diagram again. So the somatosensory areas of the cerebral cortex, the primary and the secondary somatosensory cortices, they do different things for us. The primary somatosensory cortex, like I just briefly said on the last slide, receives somatotopically organized information and discriminates the size, texture, and shape of objects. The secondary somatosensory cortex analyzes information from the primary sensory area and the thalamus. It provides stereognosis and memory of the tactile and spatial environment. So remember that example where I said you're reaching in the bag for a key, you're looking for your keys or something? So the primary somatosensory cortex goes, oh, here's something, it's small, it's pointy, it might be the right shape, and the secondary somatosensory cortex compares it to our information, our memory, and it says, oh, that's my house key, I can get in. And it remembers the tactile and spatial environment and applies that sensory information to it. Pretty neat, huh? So this is the sensory homunculus. This is a slice of the cerebral cortex, and the homunculus is a map that was developed by recording responses of awake individuals during surgery, and it illustrates the proportions and arrangement of cortical areas that contain representations of the surface of the body. So you can see that a huge amount of cortical surface is dedicated to our hands and our face and our mouth, and then smaller areas to our limbs, and that sort of thing. And that makes sense because as human beings, we have to survive. We have to find food and bring it to our mouths, right? And know whether it's okay to eat. So a lot of our sensory brain surface is dedicated to those important areas.